the Jim Heath Podcast. Today, Jim is interviewed by Amy Rogan, Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of Findlay.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. Well, I really wanted to kind of pick your brain and talk to you about because I'm doing my book, as I mentioned in my email, on journalism, politics, and religion. For me, these things kind of all come together with, my dad was a preacher and pastor, my grandparents. I grew up in the church. And having been a journalist and done a lot of work with, campaigns and debates and all the talk shows we did, um, it just really has, honestly, just, personally has kind of hurt my heart to see how the church has played into this political storm that we have had going on for the last few years. So that's kind of what led me to the book. And part of me is like, well, am I really going to do any good? Because those who have their mind made up have their mind made up. But I want to press on and see where I get, and go from there. So I kind of want to talk to you. I did watch your documentary, and I watched a little bit of it again the other day. And you talked about the liberal years of Trump. And then he goes into this. Now all of a sudden he's got evangelical support. You mentioned in your documentary, he was pro-choice. He talked about universal health care, transgenders and Miss Universe. Um, so how do you think he got tied into the conservative right, the religious right, I guess?
I think that in a parallel universe, Trump is probably president as a progressive liberal.
Yeah.
Somewhere out there in some other universe, because that's the path he was on. And in studying it and spending a year reliving 2015 and 2016, at some point during the Obama presidency, there's something that happened in Trump's psyche that cracked.
Mhm.
And we can get into racism and all of that, remembering that he and his dad were sued by the Justice Department in the early 70s because they wouldn't rent to African Americans. So we can try to psychoanalyze, where his mind and his soul and his heart is at. But there was something about Barack Obama that cracked Trump's brain, and he became the leader of the birtherism movement, questioning whether Obama was even born in the United States. And all of a sudden, he started getting applause because sharing his belief in that were a lot of the Christian right who believed that Obama was Muslim. Incorrectly, he's not, never was. But that got sewed into the psyche on the right very early on. So here comes Donald Trump, as you mentioned, a guy who was really on the political left. He was registered as a Democrat into his 60s. And something about Barack Obama he detested. And he started talking about this birtherism movement and leading it. And his loudest applause came from evangelicals on the right. And that's where I think the marriage was born. I think it was a suspicion, and some would say, I would probably say, a hatred of Obama. That when President Obama won re-election in 2012, remember, Trump thought about taking him on, and he was the front runner in polls for a while in 2011. And then he decided, as most of us thought, that he wasn't really going to pull the trigger and do it, and he endorsed Mitt Romney, and Romney lost that election. And I think Trump cracked even further the thought that this guy that he detested, who he questioned whether he was even American, gets reelected president after a whole lot of money and his endorsement of Romney failed. So I think that that's sort of the origin here. Trump has always loved applause, right? He's always been kind of a quasi entertainer. And as he moved to the right, the loudest applause he was receiving when he attacked Barack Obama was coming from the evangelical right. And I think that's where the marriage was born. And while it was hard to believe what was happening in 2015, that marriage was beginning to come together. And the one thing that Trump said, he promised over and over again, is that I'll overturn Roe v. Wade. I'll appoint the judges to do that. And as president, he did that. And I think that's why it's very difficult to reach the Trump evangelical now, because I can tell you in my early days, Amy, I was a Republican activist. First 10 years of my professional career was basically on the Republican platform. I was inspired by Reagan and Bush and that whole era. But when I was a delegate to the National Convention in 1992, a Bush delegate, I was shocked even then that probably 75% of the delegates in Houston were pro-life. You know, they were anti-abortion, and they were the grassroots even then. And they went through a lot of Republican promises to overturn Roe, which has always been the number one issue on the Republican side, at least, since Reagan, for sure.
Mhm.
And Trump delivered. So now, fast forward to 2024, and you've got a guy who, through all of this last decade, from the birtherism and the anti-Obama, questioning him, now to delivering the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which is the number one issue on the evangelical right, they're locked in, and it's concrete, I think, at this point.
Mhm. How do you think we got? Okay, so let me back up a little bit. When I was growing up, like I said, my dad was a pastor, right? And I remember in the 80s asking them during the campaign, I was like, are we Democrat or Republican? And my parents just kind of looked at each other and smiled, and they said, Democrat. And I said, okay. Well, they were big Jimmy Carter fans.
Mhm.
He was the Sunday school teacher. And then Reagan came in, and at some point, I think it had more to do with Clinton and the affair. My dad switched over to Republican. My parents did. And so, and I've read and I've tried to do a lot of research, and it seems like it was about that time. It was about Ronald Reagan where um, religion and politics really started to merge. Would you agree with that synopsis, or?
Yeah, I mean, 1976, Jimmy Carter was the representative of the evangelical South,
Yeah.
and he did get overwhelming evangelical support in 76. Turned out that Carter, I'm not a religious, I'm not an expert in religion, so I hesitate sounding too expertise on this, but, Carter, I think, delivered true Christian values. And by that, I mean, he was progressive. He was concerned about the poor. He was concerned about not just the Jews, but the Arabs as well, with the Camp David peace accords. And turned out on social issues that Carter was had much more of a diverse feeling, or progressive feeling, than was comfortable. And then along came Reagan, championing for the first time in the Republican Party the anti-choice, the pro-life provisions in the Republican platform in 1980. First time, I mean, the Republican Party had been pro-choice through Nixon and Ford, and it was Reagan's people that changed that. So it gave evangelicals a place to go. And then we have the rise of the televangelists, who were very powerful. Billy Graham kind of preceded that time period, but he certainly took advantage of it. But then there was Jerry Falwell, was one of them, and others, and they gravitated on the social issues to Reagan, and Reagan openly embraced that. Of course, Reagan openly embraced, he won 49 states. So I don't want to make it sound like that's the only reason why Reagan was popular and successful, because there were a lot of other reasons. But that marriage was sort of worked out and hammered out in the 80s. And I think it helped that Reagan was so popular, because all of a sudden evangelicals felt like they had a party to go to, and they had a popular guy to kind of lead that. But Amy, I was thinking today, and you mentioned that time period, that evangelical political involvement was grounded in education, in religious education. You can argue all the time about Jerry Falwell and his political views, but no one argues that Jerry Falwell was not an expert, and well studied on religion. Same thing with Billy Graham. Same way with a lot of the other prominent evangelicals of that time period. So they were rooted, much like you and your dad. And I mean, we're talking generationally here, where these were experts, and they leaned conservative, but they were experts in the word of Christ, and in the Bible, and in religion. The difference I see today in the mega movement with Donald Trump is that the white Christian nationalist today, I don't think, has as much in common with the evangelicals that we remember prior to Trump, who were grounded in Christ's words, who could quote scripture, who were educated on, theology. I don't think the mega Christian nationalist today is grounded in theology. I think they're grounded sort of just like in their heritage. It's just the religion that's always been, and they know it they're more familiar with it than certainly the Muslim religion or Hindu religion, which just seems so foreign to them. And now it's kind of the enemy. They're kind of convincing each other in these new churches that anything that's different is an enemy. So it's a real interesting break, because there was a lot of angst from some Republicans back in that day of the growing involvement of Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and evangelicals. But now I have to say, looking back, I think there's a great big distinction between those religious leaders who were grounded in actual biblical principles and history and what we have today, which is, I'm not sure that a lot of these mega Christian nationalists could give you scripture, frankly. I think it's just part of the bubble that they're in. And that's a little disconcerting, because if you hold people accountable, again, I'm not a religious expert or a very religious person, but I love the words of Christ. And I think if we all live by the words of Christ, regardless of what religion we are, the world would be super. The world would be a lot better. And the thought of that religious involvement pre-Trump that was at least grounded in the education and the theology of Christianity was a lot better than what it's become now.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I always say is you can't legislate someone's heart. So that's the frustrating part for me, is that we're trying to legislate everyone's heart. And if we're worried about Christianity, if we're worried about following the teachings of Christ, we need to be reaching people's hearts, not legislation. Do you understand what I mean?
And I think the perfect example to me, honestly, with what you just said, is Jimmy Carter versus Donald Trump. Jimmy Carter spends his days reading the Bible. He has for decades, his entire life. He leads Sunday school classes every Sunday, or did until recently. As long as he could, he did. To me, if I want to go to someone with Christian understanding and questions about Christianity and about where the heart is and about what Jesus did to help people, poor people, sick people, lepers, people that no one else would go near, it's Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter has represented that, at least in my head, that view of Christianity more than Donald Trump. The thought that if Christ returns tomorrow and goes directly to Donald Trump and says, "Well done," right. to me, it's laughable. Of course, he goes to Jimmy Carter and says, "Well done, well done," balancing politics and religion and not wearing it on your sleeve, but just trying to lead by example. There's your guy. Not the billionaire who bankrupted casinos and married several times and it's just so upside down. But again, I think that Trump's view of Christian nationalism is not theology. It's trying to drive a wedge through heritage much more than theology, and I think that's where the trouble is.
There are just so many things I want to talk to you about. That brings up. I was just watching the Holy Post podcast, and they were talking about Bonnie Christian article in Christianity Today called "The Trump Debate is Dead," and she talks about how with the true evangelical voter who is for Trump, there's no discussion anymore. It's just Trump, and they're just party voting down the ticket. So I thought that was really interesting. She said she suspect those decisions been long made, and it's just splitting. Oh, she talks about how it splits the evangelicals in kind of a line, like you have your elite evangelicals, your like theologians and stuff that are still open, that are still talking about it, and then you have the other ones where the discussions just all but disappeared. It just is Trump. And I don't know, for me, I see a lot of my church friends embracing some of the political rhetoric, and I'm just like, that doesn't sound like the Gospels. That doesn't sound like the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't sound like Jesus to me. So have you watched God Forbid on the Jerry Falwell Jr. documentary? Yeah,
I haven't seen it. No.
Okay, really interesting how it kind of shows how influential he was in getting Trump into the political campaign, into the presidential campaign.
Well, it's mentioned a little bit, in the documentary, and we now know that Michael Cohen had goods on,
Yes.
and so that that's troubling.
Yes, right. And it just really makes you wonder, like, what are all these things that had to fall into place to kind of put Trump where he is, and who's responsible? I think in your documentary you talk about Sarah Palin endorsing him, um, and one thing I wanted to ask you about was, we're skipping ahead a little bit, but post January 6th, Kevin McCarthy goes down to Mar-a-Lago, and basically it seems like he could have said, all right, we're done with them. We're done. After this insurrection, we're done. But instead, he ends up going to Mar-a-Lago, and then everything kind of goes back to Trump favor. Do you kind of see that, or am I misinterpreting that?
I think it would have been difficult. Trump was going to do what Trump wants to do, and I don't think the party was going to be able to tell him to exit the stage. And I think he was angling for the rematch from the very beginning, and now he's got all of these court proceedings and just everything hanging off his shoulders, and he just keeps trudging along because the loyalty is there of the grassroots. And there are a variety of reasons for that. The white working class in those states that gave him the election. People need to remember that, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by several million, and she only lost in the Electoral College by about 77,000 votes in 4 different states that tipped the blue firewall states that she had kind of taken for granted. Huge mistake on her and her campaign's part. Obviously, they should have spent more time in Michigan and other places. But so Trump barely got through 2016. It was hardly a mandate. And the fact that those states tipped the other way, in 2020 is not much of a surprise to people that follow politics and, just look at the numbers on it. But the white working class that he brought out, I'll go back and say from my Republican days, when you looked at that big coalition that Reagan put together, there was always the fringe, and they were always there. The John Birch Society, there was some KKK, but there was always the fringe, but they were under rocks, deeply under rocks. And Reagan famously said at the '84 convention, we welcome everybody into our party but the bigots. And that was what Reagan said from the podium in 1984 as he's accepting the nomination. We welcome everyone in the Republican Party but the bigots.
Many people are welcome in our house, but not the bigots.
And then fast forward to Trump, where what he's done is he's made it fashionable for individuals who used to be in the shadows in the Republican Party to literally come out and speak their truths. And now a lot of them have run for precinct level positions in the Republican Party across the country, and they're becoming the Republican Party.
I guess, one thing that bothers me is, like, I was talking to one of our pastor friends several years ago during the campaign, and he was talking about the prophecy of Trump. And I don't know if you've studied that much at all. And they all just believe that. And I think there was a literal golden idol at the convention. And there was, there's just been a number of things that make me go, how do they, do the mental gymnastics for that to kind of to justify all that? And I'm not sure people really understand how much influence religion had in getting him where he is. And I think that's the interesting part of Jerry Falwell Jr. and some others that,
it just seems like, if anything, to a lot of what I understand about Christianity, it just seems like he would be like the false prophet, or, he might be the one coming back that's not good, based on how he's just fooling people. But I'm always a little amazed at, the right has been so successful in creating this Christian nationalism on the right, where people on the right feel so comfortable. And again, not based on theology, but just the comfort and the heritage that they share. But I'm always amazed at the left. And I think it's because the left are more skeptical and they just won't kind of buy into that. And so maybe there's more reluctance or just less urgency to kind of fight back. You know,
Right.
to a lot of people on the left, it's still about the religion. It's not about the politics. So if you don't have that countermeasure on the left that just plays that game of tennis, you know, where something outrageous comes out from Christian nationalism on the right, you know, the left immediately responds. It's sort of missing, and I kind of understand why it is, but it's too bad that it is, because you know, I know that there are evangelicals that just have to, you know, think to themselves again. The Jimmy Carters were like, what is happening? How is this guy leading so many pastors and so many congregations down this path of denial of election results and vaccine questions, and now in court, you know, he's yelling at judges and getting away with it. You know, I mean, there's got to be like sensible Christians thinking, you know, where is he? You know, Carter was out building houses when he lost.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, it's just it's too bad that the religious left doesn't push back. But again, I completely understand it. They're just they're more into the religion part of this than they are the political part.
Is there a way to get the Christian, well, I guess the MAGA and the evangelicals, is there a way to get them to recognize what's really happening, or they want what's really happening?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, you know, in 20 years, the country is going to be a majority of the country will be non-white, and I just think in a lot of places in this country, you know, when you don't meet somebody of a different religion or a different color or sexual orientation, when you don't meet anyone outside of your mold, and all of a sudden you're seeing faces on social media and on television and in the movies that are just different than you are. And that's going to increase over the next 20 years as the population changes, as the country becomes even more diverse. You know, you can go one of two ways. If you have an inspirational figure like Reagan come along and talk about how we're all trying to be a shining city on a hill, you know, perhaps you can steer that scared population or that fearful population, resentful population into a better place in their minds and their hearts. Maybe you can open up the mind. But when you have a Donald Trump here who's simply stirring their angst and their anxiety and their resentment and their anger and their fear about what's happening, my only fear is that without that education in those areas where they don't know anything else, and without somebody trying to appeal to their better angels, you know, about how this is a good thing with liberty and justice for all. You've been saying it your entire life, you know, every day in school, with liberty and justice for all. You know, you can't say now, well, I didn't really mean it. You know, I only meant it if we had over, you know, 70% of the population. You know, you got to have somebody kind of appealing and talking about how good that is for the country. They shouldn't be fearful for their children or grandchildren, but that voice right now is not there.
Do you think the extreme right would be where it is now without Trump?
No, no, I don't. I think that Trump made it fashionable. Again, going back to my Republican days, the fringes were always uncomfortable to come forward, and they would be knocked back by the John McCains, and they would just be knocked back within the party. Trump, you know, gave them light, told them to come out from under the rocks and be participants, and not only to be participants, but to lead. And so we see more and more, and it's the grassroots level where it's from a party perspective, where it's most troubling to me. You know, it's everybody knows the candidate for U.S. Senate or governor, but the party is made up of people from communities across states. And those precinct meetings are what determines, you know, who is leading the party. And a lot of those seats now have flipped to 100%, you know, Trump supporters, not party people, not Republicans, really. They're just kind of loyal to MAGA. They're loyal to Trump. So I don't know that anyone else could have pulled that off. You know, he was in the right place at the right time in an election cycle that we look back on now and realize that a majority of Americans wanted their president to be angry about stuff. And, you know, he rode that to a bare victory against Hillary. And I don't know that anyone else could have done it.
I could probably sit here and talk to you for a long, long time, Jim.
Me too.
But
This is great.
I know. I'm afraid I've taken up a lot of your time already.
All good.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, I'm just personally flabbergasted. We haven't found a church since this whole thing started that we can go to. So that's been kind of discouraging, but I just kind of try to keep reading and stay in the word and find those voices of reason.
There's got to be a Jimmy, and I have to believe it's the majority. In my heart, I believe it's a majority, but the Jimmy Carter Coalition within the evangelical community, within congregations, has to be a majority still. And the question is, how do you represent those people, and how do their voices begin to push back? Because the Christian nationalism is not going away. It just isn't going to go away, and it's going to become more and more hardened with the right, because so many on the right, have just kind of glued themselves to it. So, I think voices of reason, the voices of the left, are going to have to find this podcast that you mentioned that you listen to, and other avenues like that, but much bigger, are going to have to kind of organize and begin to kind of fight back. The irony, Amy, I'll leave you with this. The irony of this is what Christian nationals and the far right seemingly want is more like Iran than the United States. And every day I think about that, I'm like, you want a religious state. You want your views to be the views of the land, the laws of the land. How is that any different than what Iran does to its citizens and its people that disagree and have different points of view? We don't want to be that. We pride ourselves with not being that. So, but in some places in the country, I think they're going to have political power, and that might grow in the next 20 years. And it's probably going to be, the people that represent it are probably going to be angry, and they're going to be resentful. Same thing we see from Trump, and that's going to be troubling.
What's also interesting about the article I mentioned by Bonnie Christian in Christianity Today, she says that she talked to an older white male relative, and said something about the Access Hollywood tapes. And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Hadn't heard of it. Didn't know anything about, the classified papers, the indictments, was just completely unaware, apparently, of that stuff.
You know what I think it is? I think a lot of this is people who hate politics. Think of the friends that you had in high school, that hated social studies, they hated history, current events, politics. They were into math or science or something else. Those individuals have just gravitated to Trump because just talk to a mega person about what you just mentioned or any history at all, and it goes over their heads. A lot of them don't know because they haven't studied it and they're not interested in it. So he's appealed. It's sort of like if you elected me to be, president of the American Math Association. What would I do? I would downgrade math. I would question everything about it, how dumb it is. And, and there would probably be a lot of Americans who would gravitate to that because we hate math. Well, I think of Trump in the same way, that he's actually a Pied Piper for individuals who just hated the whole topic, all of their lives, not understood it. They didn't like history. They didn't like reading the book. They had no interest in it. And he manages because he doesn't either. So, they gravitate to him because he's the guy that, hates it as much as they do. Oh.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate this so much.
I'm glad that we solved all the problems of the world.
Yes, of course we did. All right.
Anytime.
Thank
you. See ya.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Jim Heath Podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Please be sure to like the Jim Heath channel, subscribe, and check back for our next episode. Thank you for joining us.